Good evening, and welcome to the Adath Israel Congregation's presentation featuring Dr. Brant Slomovic. My name is Deanna Rosenzweig. I am a member of Adath Israel. I'm a retired banker, a published author, and I too am locked down at home like all of you. These are very difficult and challenging times that our community is facing. We hope you're well and you're safe, and we're so pleased that you're sharing this evening with us. I'm also like to extend a warm welcome to a number of special guests. Maya Sutnick, who's the Emeritus Curator of Photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Tina Boyman-Koffler, the immediate past chair of the Koffler Center, and Sam Mogilonsky, Director of Arts, Culture, and Heritage at UJA. Tonight, we are so excited to feature Brant Slomovic. Recently, Brant appeared in a front-page article in the Times of Israel. That's where we learned that he was not only a photojournalist, but a frontline emergency doctor in Toronto. Brant's topic is examining humanity through a photo lens. I'm also lucky enough to be able to introduce you to and welcome Naomi Harris, our moderator tonight. Naomi is a visual artist who seeks out interesting cultural trends to document. Her projects have included Haddon Hall, in which she followed elderly residents of a Miami Beach hotel. America Swings, which documents the phenomenon of lifestyle and was published by Taschen. EUSA, the homogenization of European and American cultures, published by Kara Verlag. Naomi's accolades include the FUAM Book Award, a Canada Council for the Arts grant, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, a long-term career advancement grant from the Canada Council, and the 2001 International Prize for Young Photojournalism, Build a Forum. Please welcome Naomi to the stage.
Hi, thank you, Deanna, for that lovely introduction. I feel like you've also really introduced Brant, so I'm just going to say a couple of things. First of all, here's his beautiful book, The Cracks in Everything, which we're going to be discussing tonight. You're all in for a real treat. I'm really excited to share this work with you tonight, or actually Brant's going to share the work. So I don't want to say too much, but basically, Brant is, as Deanna already mentioned, a Canadian photo essayist based in Toronto, and he also is an ER doctor. It's his experiences as a frontline doctor that inform his unique perspective on the human condition, and it's an attribute he carries with him into his role as a storyteller and image maker. He employs long-form documentary projects to examine narratives of culture and identity. What underlies Brant's approach is a viewpoint that considers every person through a lens of commonality and connection, hence the topic of his presentation, examining humanity through the photo lens. Brant's work has been published widely, and it appears in private collections internationally. And in 2020, he published his first book, The Cracks in Everything, published by my publisher, Kara Verlag. He's currently working on a long-term project about shinny hockey. So if anyone has a backyard rink here in Toronto and some grandkids or maybe kids, you might want to invite Brant over to photograph some hockey in the backyard. I also want to encourage the guests to type in the corner. You can type in questions to ask Brant during the Q&A. That would be great. We would appreciate that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my friend Brant, the first person I call when I have a mysterious pain or headache, Brent Slomovic.
How are you, Naomi? Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
And always a pleasure to take your calls, whether they're photographic or medical related.
Unfortunately, lately, I think they're more medical related.
Well, there's a pandemic going on after all, so it's appropriate.
I think with all the Zoom, I'm getting weird headaches and stuff, and you being the eye specialist, you're always the person I call.
Yeah, let's talk offline.
Well, I'm trying to remember, how did we first meet anyway? Was it Open Show? Was that where we first met?
Yeah, we met through a common friend who's a colleague of mine, who's a close friend of yours from high school, I believe. who asked me to join her at this event that she didn't really know what it was about, but it was about photography. She knew I was a photographer, and she said, my friend's speaking at this event, would you come with me? And I said, well, who's your friend? She said, Naomi Harris. I said, I know Naomi Harris. I don't know her, but I know her work, and I love her work. And that was the start of a friendship that has blossomed definitely through the pandemic, but even beforehand.
So that was like probably back in 2017 before I moved back from Los Angeles.
I think you were just in the transition point.
Well, I guess it's our shared interest in photography, the fact that we both keep freelance hours, so we can often go for lunch and coffees when everyone else is at work, and the fact that neither one of us ever had kids, and we have dogs, and we went for dog walks. That's probably how our friendship blossomed.
Exactly.
Before, I was thinking about it before we started our talk tonight, and your project is so extensive. Like, obviously, you did not go and photograph this in like 1 or 2 trips. How many years were you on this project?
Yeah, so the project was 5 years in the making. So there
Wow.
were about 8 trips over the course of 5 years, and then about a year to do the design work and the editing work, and then the fabrication of the book. So the whole thing is about 6 years in total.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah.
You know what? I think you should just start showing us some work, and then hopefully we get some questions, and I can ask you some more questions after, but people are probably excited
Perfect.
to see pictures.
Great, let's do it. So thank you to Deanna and Naomi for those amazing introductions. It's a real privilege and pleasure to present the work to you and to tell you what this whole project is about and how it is that I managed to balance a life as a photographer, but also as a frontline doctor in 2021 during a pandemic. So I'm going to start just by showing a series of photographs from the Cracks and Everything, which is a project about lone soldiers in Israel, but really it's more a project about a search for belonging that is so common to many of us and asks the question, how far is one willing to go to find a home or a place of belonging? So we'll do about 12 images, and then I'll tell you a bit more about the project. So I think the first question everyone wants to know, if you don't know about this, because I had no clue what a lone soldier was until I started the research phase of this project 5 or 6 years ago. A lone soldier, according to the Israeli military, is a definition of a service person in the Israeli Defense Forces without family or immediate family in Israel. They generally serve in regular units of the IDF, and most choose to serve in a combat unit. At any time, there are about 5,000 to 7,000 lone soldiers from around 70 countries around the world serving in the Israeli army. About 50% of lone soldiers are non-Israelis of Jewish background, often volunteering through a variety of international programs. And there are about 50% of lone soldiers who are native to Israel and are lone soldiers because one of estrangement from their families or for religious reasons. So they're basically choosing to serve, and then they're sort of forgotten by their families or banished from their families for their choice to serve the state of Israel. This is a young woman named Hadar, who I photographed in Tel Aviv. She's an Air Force mechanic who was extremely proud of her service, and she had just an unfortunate family situation by which she was estranged from her parents and was a lone soldier by designation, but is an Israeli national. So the project began, to be honest, with just a sense, having made a few trips to Israel over the course of my life, that there was work for me to do there. There was something about this dichotomy and this question I had with why I feel like I belong in Israel, why I feel connected to a place so far away, and why I feel physically transformed when I'm there, which goes beyond the romance of travel that makes everyone feel good. I generally feel in some ways that a city like Tel Aviv, for example, is more what feels like home than a place like Toronto, where I've been living for 10 years. And the idea was, once I found this story of lone soldiers through this article in Haaretz, I kind of was taken aback by this extraordinary expression of desire to belong to something and to serve a place that is not their birthplace. And over a course of time, what happened is the story of lone soldiers, the idea of lone soldiers as being the center of this work, was that it would be an avenue for me to ask questions about myself, about my own choices, to better understand this connection to a place through people who are living and putting themselves online for somewhat similar reasons. This is Leah. She's from Los Angeles, California, and she's the first lone soldier I photographed. This was after about 6 months of trying to negotiate with the idea to give me permission to photograph on the military bases, because if you don't represent the New York Times or the Washington Post, it's generally not so easy to gain access. And I think, to be honest, the first time they let me onto a base, it was mostly just to get me off their backs, because I was hounding them with emails and phone calls and pulling all the strings I could. And the amazing thing about photographing Leah was, like many young people, they're used to Instagram and other forms of social media photographing, but they had never sat for a formal portrait. And it took about 30 minutes to sort of loosen her up and get to know her. And I usually spend about an hour to 2 hours, sometimes more, just talking about them and their experiences and where they come from and their journey before I take my camera to the bag. And once I started photographing Leah, within a few minutes, she sort of just let down her guard and was just supernatural in front of the camera, and beautiful and powerful and stoic. And she represented exactly what I wanted this project to be about. And I remember the time when I flipped the camera around to show her on the back of the digital camera what it looked like, and her whole demeanor lit up, and confidence arose from someone who was fairly timid and shy to begin with, even though she's carrying a whole lot of weaponry. And the first moment I saw this photograph, I knew that there was a project to be done here. This is Belen. She is another one of the soldiers I met in one of my last trips. She's a 19-year-old who emigrated from Argentina, with just an amazing story. She is another one of the soldiers who had a fairly complicated life back in Argentina, a little bit of a family dynamic that wasn't particularly supportive, and ended up moving away from her primary family to her grandmother's home, where her grandmother was having some of her grandkids in a Jewish school in Argentina, even though they weren't Jewish. And the reason they were there was because it happened to be the best private school in the town where they were living. And through this Jewish school, where she was basically a foreigner, she started to learn a bit of Hebrew and was invited to bat mitzvahs, which she told me was shocking because she'd never seen or heard of one. And then she also had the opportunity to learn about programs that would send South American students over to Israel for exchange programs, which is how she ended up in Israel. Once she was in Israel, she felt very at home and comfortable and felt accepted, which she told me she never really felt quite the same at home in Argentina. She met a boy, she fell in love, converted to Judaism, and she enlisted in the army. She chose to enlist in a mixed gender battalion, so men and women fighting together. And this is just a very typical story of these incredible young kids who have this inner desire to do something different, and this search for a place where they feel like they belong and want to contribute. Shachar is a gentleman I met who originates from Valencia, Spain. He goes by Shachar, which is not his original name. His name is Andres, but this is his adopted name, and this is how he wanted to be referred to. So I met and photographed Shachar in November of 2018 in the Golan Heights, right on the border of Lebanon, the very north of Israel. And so Shachar was not raised Jewish. He was born in Valencia. He was actually not raised with any particular religious affiliation, but he had a grandfather who was Jewish, which enables him under the law of return to Israel, or to emigrate to Israel and serve in the military, which is something he decided to do. I believe, like many, Shachar was someone who was just in search of his place and his identity. I met him, I photographed him, and I walked away from our first encounter feeling like I just didn't quite get the image I was after. I knew this was a complicated young guy, and I knew he had a lot to say. I knew he was one of those guys who feels a lot of things. And I think just because of the setup of the first shoot around his fellow soldiers who were kind of giving him a tough time about being the center of attention, it just didn't happen. So I was driving away from this base in the north of Israel with my IDF attaché, and I said, I need to go back tomorrow. I need to meet him again. I need to photograph him again. Can you please do whatever you need to do? And these things are not so simple in Israel. You know, the setting up of meetings and finding lone soldiers and getting the IDF to give you permission and being on the base when they're on the base and not out doing maneuvers is really challenging. So it was really a lucky moment where he was available the next day. We drove back up, and this time I just had this intuition to take him off the base, away from his comrades, and just engage with him in a little bit of privacy. And we just took a walk down this beautiful road in the Golan Heights, and he sort of opened up and we started talking about his family life. And he told me that he'd come to Israel. And again, it's a story of falling in love with not only a woman in Israel, but also people, and finding a brotherhood and an acceptance in Israel that he didn't feel growing up in Spain. And it's the first time that I got close in with a photograph on lone soldiers. So the idea from the beginning was to shoot them really from a distance, and to place them in the center of the frame, to show the surroundings and to connect them with the land that they had traveled all this way to serve and defend and to put their life on the line for. But for some reason with Shachar, I felt I needed to get closer and witness his vulnerability and make a portrait that revealed a bit more details of expression. And this fundamentally changed the shape of the book. So it went from being a book that was landscape and very sort of wide portraits to a few portraits that were a little bit more intimate in connecting to the soldiers and giving a bit more depth to the story. The same goes for Sarah. She is a really interesting young woman. I should say that I'm in touch with many of these soldiers even after the book project has been done. We've connected through social media, and I'm in touch with them, and I share the work with them, obviously, and I sort of make this little arrangement, and I send them a copy of the image because I think it's, you know, they're participating as much as I am in making a portrait together, and I feel like they should have a physical picture to commemorate the relationship and also the experience. So Sarah's from Five Towns, New York. She was serving in an artillery battalion, and I photographed her in a base just outside of Jerusalem. And what I loved about Sarah was, again, I sensed this woman who was this very brave seeker. She considered herself a religious person, and was interesting in that she loved the diversity that existed within this term. She thought that religious could be a whole lot of different things. And she said, I'm way more religious than my family, but I think we're all considered religious. And she was very proud of her individuality. And even though the photograph doesn't show it, she's actually wearing a skirt. She's one of the few women I met and photographed in the IDF who was wearing a skirt. And she was doing it specifically to make it seen and known that religious people feel the same things and want to do the same things as other Israelis, but she wanted to maintain her identity. We just happened to go in with this photo again, I wanted a bit more detail and connection to her eyes. And even though you don't see her skirt, I thought this was a stronger image of the ones I photographed of her. Another part of the project and the book were a series of landscape images, which were really important for me because I really wanted to connect the people to the place that they had chosen to travel so far to serve. And I thought, you know, the land of Israel, unfortunately, is one that is imbued with a history of conflict. And what I tried to do with the landscapes is to show how over time the conflict and humans have sort of changed the physical spaces. So some of the landscapes are sort of what I call a biblical scene. For example, this one here of the two donkeys grazing in a desert plain. And the landscapes and the other component of the project, which are still lives, the last two, the landscapes and still lives, were really made from a place of a visceral reaction to the surroundings. So it wasn't much of just what I happened to see along the way. It was a place that I happened to see where I felt something physical shift, or I felt something that connected me to the subject I had photographed previously. This is a military installation in the south of Israel, which is used for close combat training. So it's a mock-up of Palestinian village that's in the middle of the desert. You can see those are tank treads. So this is a place where the IDF would practice sort of close-in combat and rescue missions. This is just outside of Jerusalem. And again, here I'm just trying to show how the landscape has been changed and carved out over time by this history of conflict, which to some level the lone soldiers are participating in, even though that's not their intention. I think it's a consequence of what they've chosen to do. And then there's a few still lifes, and the still lifes really for me are just a way to sort of cleanse the palate from what can be a very intense experience looking at photographs. And they're also just quirky things that I sort of found that are typical in Israel and on some of the military bases. So this is just off a military base in the town of Hebron, which is a fairly intense place. It's the only place that perhaps I felt some degree of unsafety photographing as a foreign and as a Jewish photographer. But there were always something of interest for me to photograph, even in places where the energy was fairly intense and scary. And another component of the book, which I would call a still life, are a series of photographs that I made about the flora of Israel. So the plant life around the country. For me, again, this was a little bit of a reference to something sort of biblical in nature. These are desert reeds that are photographed in a wadi in the desert south of Jerusalem. And I just like the evoking of an old story, and also something that ties the portraits to something physical in the landscape. So this book, as I previously mentioned with Naomi, was photographed over 5 years. There were multiple trips to Israel, and I basically covered bases from the very north of Israel. This again is the Golan Heights, all the way down to the border of Gaza and into the West Bank in certain areas. And it was a real privilege and pleasure, because I recognized very soon that not only was I meeting a very interesting and dynamic and extraordinary group of young people who've come from all over the place to be in Israel, but it got me into places that, had I not had the badge of a journalist or a photographer or storyteller, would never have gotten me into. So this is just maybe 100 meters from the border of Lebanon, just after the tunnels were discovered that went from the north into some of the small towns and kibbutzes in the Golan Heights. This is back in Hebron, and this is a really lovely young guy named Josh, who's from New York, who was one of the few commanders in the IDF. So he's a lone soldier, but he had achieved a fairly high state of rank in the army, primarily because his Hebrew was particularly good, and he had incredible leadership skills and was just an interesting guy. And we talked about how he was teaching his soldiers underneath him relaxation techniques and yoga, specifically in meditation, so that when they were in combat missions, they had a place to return to calm themselves down and to find a place of equanimity. And again, this is another soldier I'm in touch with, and Josh has an interesting story, because what he's done is he's turned his lone soldier experience into a bit of a maneuver in the politics of Israel, which has a situation where the lone soldiers are not being as well supported as they had hoped to have been, or as they were promised. So they're finding that once they finish their service, their access to funds in terms of supporting their education and their housing for a few years after service are not really being allocated as needed. So he's taken up a very proactive and a very much a supportive role for all the lone soldiers who are currently serving, and he's just an incredible young guy. And so the photographs were taken over the course of 5 years. I worked with some great Israeli photographers and assistants over time. This is one that was taken by my assistant in the Dead Sea region of Israel. And then the book was compiled and edited over the course of a year with a dear friend and a great photographer named Jan Osil, who's based out of Brussels. And I was very fortunate to have the interest of Naomi's book publisher, Kara Verlag, in Germany, who saw the work and thought they had never seen anything like it before, and engaged to publish it. So it is out as of September. And I think what happened for me after making this book was what led to the next project for me, which is the project about COVID-19, which I titled anything but normal. And so I've always had this sort of split duality of photographer and physician, and I never crossed the two paths. For one, it was sacred for me to have an art practice and an expression practice that was separate from the intensity and the intellectual rigors of medicine and academic medicine specifically. And because of the intensity of my day job as an emergency doctor, I needed the quiet and the solitude and the loneliness of the artist life and of traveling around the world and making photographs. And when I started out, I think my earlier photography work, specifically my portraits, were fairly distant and cold. And I think the reason for that is when I started making portraits, you know, one of the things you gain from being an emergency room doctor is you walk into a room, you introduce yourself, and within a very short period of time, you enter into very detailed and very personal conversations and intimate conversations fairly quickly. So I had the comfort of walking into introducing myself and gaining the trust of whoever I was communicating with. But at the same time, as a physician, you need to maintain a certain level of professionalism and distance, because otherwise you probably couldn't do what you do because of what you see with on a daily basis and what you deal with on a daily basis. And the problem is when I was switching and transitioning to being a portrait photographer, I was taking both of those things with me. And the portraits just weren't quite working. I was not allowing myself to be vulnerable with the people I was photographing, and I wasn't allowing myself to let down the barrier that normally protects me from the medical side of things. And when I started photographing the little soldiers, things changed. So I started to recognize that I needed to allow myself to be a bit more vulnerable, and I needed to have different kinds of conversations and ask different kinds of questions with the soldiers. And it changed me. It allowed me to see a different way of being with another person in a room. And so one thing influences the other. So the photography influences the medicine as much as the medicine influences the photography. When I finished publishing the book and finished the work on the book, it was February of last year. So I had gone to Brussels and I had met with my designer. We made all the final decisions. We picked the linen for the cover. We picked the paper material. We did the final editing of the sequence of the book. And I flew back to Toronto, and a week later, the pandemic was officially announced. The lockdown went into place, the first lockdown, the first wave. And what happened was I returned to work where everything was completely different. It was a place that I didn't almost recognize, and everything about work changed from the way I prepared to go to work and left my house to how I functioned at work and what I was seeing on the job. And I felt like I needed to document it. So it was really out of a place of not being familiar in something that I was, I think, an expert in, and something that was very second nature and something that I was extremely comfortable with, to going to work and not being certain of my safety, not being certain of what I was going to bring home to my family. I went from being fairly casually dressed at work to, as you can see here, surgical scrubs, a scrub cap, a visor, protective goggles, a face mask that changed with what I was doing specifically in the emergency department. And all these images were taken through an iPhone, which is also not my usual way of working. I usually work with a fairly high-end digital camera or film cameras. But because there was this fear of contamination and not knowing how COVID was spread at that time, we were all putting our phones into Ziploc bags. And I thought this was so strange. And I'd never used my phone for photography before. But this was a time that just seemed like the right time and place to do it. And what I loved about it was it gave you the sense of what it felt like to be working in this circumstance where everything was kind of semi-blurry. You were always looking through a shield and a visor. It was difficult to breathe. It was somewhat suffocating. It was sort of like being underwater. And I started to make this body of work. So this work was shot over about 3 weeks. And the other thing that allowed me to do this work was people's willingness to share and people's willingness to be photographed in a workspace and in a vulnerable position, so to speak. It was all done with the hospital's consent, and everyone was appropriately permissioned because of the nature and the sensitivity of personal information. And it was part of this incredible project called the Canada COVID Portrait. which featured everything from professional photographers to amateur photographers who were spending their time during COVID capturing and documenting what it was like as Canadians to go through the process. So some of these images are quite intimate. This is a young woman who was recommissioned, so she wasn't doing her normal job. We were finding that, with surgical operating rooms being closed and research being closed, some staff members were asked to do things that they weren't necessarily trained for, but were retrained because of the flow of patients into the emergency department. So this is a young woman who's basically just sitting, just taking care of a patient who was at risk for fleeing the emergency department. And so she was there almost as a secondary security and a care person. COVID has taken a toll physically on all of us. I think in the emergency department, everything from using Purell 50, 60 times a day and washing your hands constantly because of being afraid of touching things and spreading disease. So people were experiencing lots of hand issues and skin issues, and the masks tend to make it hard to breathe, so headaches and those things are fairly common. And everyone kept saying that this is the new normal. And to me, that was just an odd statement, and I found it was anything but normal. Like I said, everything really had changed. This is walking to the hospital now. There's a screening set of questions that you have to answer every time you walk into the hospital to make sure you're not at risk for having COVID. You're handed a mask the minute you walk in the hospital as well, so everyone is complying with the current recommendations. And this is the phone that photographed most of the images in this project. So again, it's in a Ziploc bag. And thankfully, we're not in the same state as we were back in March and April and May. We understand the disease process and how COVID spreads with a bit more intelligence and a bit of experience. And so my phone is no longer in a Ziploc bag, and I've not continued the project. The project is basically over at this point, which is a good thing. And we're moving onwards and forwards. And I've recently received my vaccine, which I don't have a photograph in this presentation, but I'm happy to say it's the first sense of relief and a first glimmer of hope in what's been a fairly challenging year. So those are the slides and the images I was willing to share or hoping to share with you. And we'll bring back Naomi, and I'm sure there's lots of questions and lots to chat about.
I have a lot of questions actually from just your talk, but first of all, I just wanted to say, I think this is the first time where the expression "don't quit your day job" doesn't apply to you, because I think you should keep both jobs. We like both things. You're a great photographer, but also you obviously have an empathy and a sympathy as a doctor.
Thanks.
Which it really made me wonder. When you're doing these photo shoots, you're being attended with the whole time. Like you have a host or a handler, right?
With the IDF?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's I have a spokesperson who is assigned to me by the IDF. So there's a large spokesperson's unit that handles all media affairs. And a spokesperson who I had to go through to gain access to all the soldiers. So essentially the soldiers have to be sort of contacted, and they have to agree to be a part of the project. So that was the job of my spokesperson, and on most shoots I was accompanied to a base by him or someone else from the spokesperson's unit, and then there was a base spokesperson commander. And the interesting thing was, and frankly I was a little bit surprised because I have friends who've done a fair bit of work with the US military, and I was given pretty much free access the entire time. I was told very minimally what I couldn't and could do, and that was mostly for security and not to divulge any sort of strategic locations or weaponry. But I was free to ask whatever questions I wanted and photograph the soldiers freely, completely.
Oh, really? Okay.
And additionally, I was able to leave the bases and leave Israel without showing it to a censor. So I left with a very just implicit agreement that before I published the book, they would see the photographs, make sure they met the security criteria, and then I was free to use almost everything. I think there was only, in 10,000 images, one image that they said I couldn't use. It was just because it revealed where a base was location-wise.
Well, that's funny, because that was actually our very first question was, were your images reviewed or censored in any way by the Army? But there you go, you're like telepathic or whatever. The same person also asked, though, if you would describe your camera and the lenses you used. Were you
Yeah, so
shooting
that's
film
actually-
or digital?
So it's an interesting, it's a funny question actually. So most of my work up until this project has been film work. So as you know, I shoot a series of film medium format cameras. And when I went to Israel for the first time, I hadn't even thought about Lone Soldiers yet. It was just, I went to Israel, I started shooting, I was reading everything I could read about Israel. You know, I was obsessed with Israeli news. I was reading novels and literature and TV shows, and I was looking at any photo book I could see that had been already made in Israel to know what was done before me. And I went to Israel for my first trip with a film camera, and I thought I should bring a digital camera as a backup just in case. It's the only place I've traveled to, and I've traveled all over the world photographing, where somehow my film got pulled by security and got exposed to the x-ray machines and ruined. And luckily I had a backup of everything on digital. So that first photograph of Leah, the beautiful blonde soldier, that was the first shoot that was shot on film and on digital, but my film was ruined by Israeli security. So I've used a bunch of digital cameras over the years as technology has changed over the last 5 years, but I'm basically shooting a bunch of different Fuji cameras.
Okay, that's interesting. Another question was, how many soldiers did you meet with and converse with prior to deciding to take a photo of that soldier? So like, and that's another thing that was really interesting to me. Like, in such a short period of time, it feels like you really made a strong connection with that person. Like these pictures, I mean, how many minutes or hours would you have spent with each subject?
It varied. And sometimes it was just a matter of like the soldier had 30 minutes on the base and to go off onto some training exercise. Ideally, which was what happened most of the time, I would spend a day on the base from morning till sundown. And I would meet with 3 or 4 soldiers, depending on the base, sometimes 2, sometimes 5. And I would spend the day with them, and we would just walk and talk, and they would show me their barracks, and they would show me their tanks, and they would show me, you know, their training facilities. And we would sort of just talk about what it was, where they came from, what they're going through, the challenges of being a lone soldier, with the understanding that at some point we would take a photograph. But it was really important for me to let them know that I was there to document them as they wanted to be perceived, and not as someone who came with a very specific agenda or story that I needed to tell. So, and I think I alluded to this before, the first time I photographed the lone soldiers, when I photographed Leah, I think the idea was just kind of being nice, but also just to, you know, offload me from their email and phone call lists. I think what happened was when the soldiers saw the way that I was photographing them and the way I was, you know, conducting conversations, I think they fed back to their commander, and the commander fed back to the head of the IDF that this isn't someone who's here shooting a quick story for a magazine, then who's going to go home. This was someone who was invested in telling the story and was doing it in a way that made the soldiers feel pretty good about themselves. You know, like that young woman from Argentina, Belen, when I shared her photograph and I sent her a copy of the book, she wrote me back to say how proud she felt and how incredible it made her feel that she wasn't being shown in the typical light that unfortunately is the status of the international media.
You mean on Israeli soldiers specifically?
Yes, exactly.
That's interesting. I was actually curious how you think your work would be perceived by people who aren't, let's say, members of Adath Israel.
Yeah, I think it's I think people are going to bring whatever they bring to it. You know, I think. So I should mention a couple of things. So the title of the book, The Cracks in
Which
Everything.
is actually again, telepathy. That was one of the questions.
Is that someone who's asked?
Yes.
Yeah. So it obviously is a reference to a Leonard Cohen lyric from a song called Anthem. And the connection for me was, I mean, it's a reflective title. It's a title that, you know, after making this work in 5 years and editing it hundreds of times and looking at these photographs and living them with, you know, on my wall, kind of like the way you have photographs behind you, I really tried to figure out what this was about. And I don't have a complete answer. I don't really understand what is the source of light inside these young kids who travel and take on this huge journey. And some of them can articulate it really well, and some of them can't. They just say, this is just something I needed to do. I felt I had to do. I wanted to do. So I was looking back on this project, understanding that the lone soldier story is not an easy one. It's complicated by many things. And I kind of wanted a title that was a little bit not obvious and not military in reference. And the cover of the book is done in linen that approximates the color of the Israeli soldier's uniform. But other than that, I really wanted the title to be sort of something that was more theoretical and poetic. And I turned to a source of some of my favorite poetry and music, which is Leonard Cohen. He also has a very strong connection to Israel. I don't know if you know this story, but in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War broke up, Leonard was in Greece, where he lived and was writing, and he heard that the war was happening, and he got in a boat from Hydra to Israel, and he showed up just with this inclination that he wanted to do something. It turns out he never
performing for the troops.
Yeah, so he never fought. What the story, and maybe this is legend, but this is the story I know of, was he was in Tel Aviv at a cafe, and he ran into another famous Israeli musician who said, "What are you doing here? It's wartime," and and he said, "I was in Greece and I jumped on a boat and I wanted to do something. I want to help." And this other musician, whose name is escaping me, said, "Well, you can't serve in the military, but I'm going on tour to play for the soldiers. Why don't you come with me?" There's a very famous photograph of Leonard Cohen performing in the south of Israel with a group of soldiers around him, and it's just magical. But anyways, the reference of the line, the cracks and everything, is a reference to the imperfections of life. There's a crack in everything. Life is full of imperfections. It's imperfect in our families. It's imperfect in our love life. It's imperfect in our métiers or our chosen line of work. It's imperfect in our ideologies and philosophies. And to me, this really fit with the way I feel about Israel and the way I feel about lone soldiers in general. I feel an affinity and attraction to them, but I recognize that it's a complicated story.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I was going to say that's interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think that being said, people will bring their prejudices and people will bring their preconceived ideas to the work. And I hope that the way the work is photographed and shown will make people at least think a little bit about what it's all about. And again, it's hard to say this, but it's really true because that's the intention of the work. Is it's not really a story about the army, and it's not a story necessarily about soldiers. It's a story about searching for belonging and wanting to belong to a place and what feels like home.
Well, that's interesting you say that. And it's interesting the story you mentioned of the first photographer, the Argentinian girl that you gave a picture to, and she felt so special. I'm wondering, like, of all the soldiers, I mean, first of all, how many soldiers did you actually photograph, and then how many ended up in the book?
Yeah, so I photographed probably on the order of 60.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there was a lot. So again, each day on a base was 2 to 5 soldiers, and I photographed everybody that I met. I thought that was really important to do. As a photographer, you sort of see a group of people and you kind of know who's going to be interesting and not interesting, and sometimes you're really surprised. And other times you just know, like there was a photograph of I think there was a picture of me photographing a soldier in the Golan Heights. And I knew from the minute we drove up to the front of the base and he met us at the gate that this guy was going to be amazing. It's one of my favorite photographs in the book. I thought it was important to photograph everybody. But as you know, as a photographer, sometimes your favorite photos don't make the book. And you edit the book because you have certain finite size and a finite budget, and you try and choose the best photographs to tell the best story you can. So even though I would have loved to include every soldier I photographed in the book, and I feel badly that I had great experiences and I'm in contact with people who I photographed who aren't in the book, it is really just in service of making the best piece of art you can.
Sure. How many made the cut then?
There's about 20 portraits in the book, okay, and about 40 other images that are landscapes and still lifes.
Okay. So the title, The Cracks and Everything, it makes me also think that it's a reference to things not being perfect. And I would believe that not all of these soldiers actually finish service. Yeah. Are there any downsides to the lone soldiers?
Yes, I mean, I hate to talk about the negative side of things, but if I'm going to be completely frank, and again, this is a reference to the title as well, there are some lone soldiers who don't complete their military service because it's just really brutally hard. And I think there's a beautiful essay that opens the book, or actually ends the book, by Matthew Friedman, who's just an amazing Canadian-Israeli author. He's a New York Times bestseller. He writes for the New York Times Magazine. He had 2 books that were really seminal books for me as part of the research. One is called Pumpkin Flowers, which is actually about his experience. So he's a Canadian who served in the military during the Lebanon War. And he writes about how, for Israelis, they're serving in their own country. They're one of the few militaries that serve in their own territory, which means that on weekends and Shabbat and holidays, they go back to their families and they get their food cooked for them, they get their laundry done for them, and it's a little bit extra support during what are basically 3 brutally hard years. And it's unfortunate that the lone soldiers just don't have that same sort of comfort and support system. They have other things in place, but it's not quite the same as when it's your siblings and your parents and grandparents. So some of them don't finish the service, and the other issue is that some of them don't integrate into Israeli society after they complete their service for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's language, sometimes it's finance. There's 3 things that I identified making this work that explains why soldiers come to Israel, why people make this journey, why people take on this humongous sacrifice. So one is that I think for a lot of people, Israel is a place of belonging, and specifically belonging to a lineage of 5,000 years, which is very unusual. I think it's also a refuge for persecution and from anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of the Europeans that are now immigrating to Israel from France and other places are immigrating and serving in the military because they recognize that there, unfortunately, and crazy as it sounds, is a rise of anti-Semitism all over the world. And this is something that's motivating them, sort of the same way we were raised as first generation. And if you come from a Holocaust family like I do, Israel is the only safe place. Israel is the place that when eventually this thing does happen again, because history repeats itself, this is the only place that's safe. I think, unfortunately, in 2021, young kids around the world are starting to get that sense that this is a possibility. And the third thing is that it's a place to serve and to contribute, to be bigger than you are as an individual, which is, again, I'm going to reference something in the book. The book is opened by a quote from the author Sebastian Junger in a book he wrote called Tribe. So Sebastian Junger is an American who's done a bunch of books and movies about the American military. He embedded with the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He did a movie called Restrepo, and he did a documentary of Tim Hetherington, who was a British war photographer who died in Libya. And the quote says something like, "Humans don't."
Do you want me to read it?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, I found it. Okay.
Awesome.
Humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive on it. What they mind is not feeling necessary.
And I think that is more relevant in 2021 than it was when I started making the book 6 years ago.
And it's interesting because I think everyone wants to go to Israel because what are they at? 65% vaccinated. Oh my goodness.
Exactly.
Well, I'm looking at the book now and it smells so great. And I mean, it's the kind of thing, if
only
you're a book
photographer
lover,
would say that, by the way.
well, it's that ink and the paper feels beautiful. It is really a beautiful book and it's got such a nice feel to it.
Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else has any other questions that they want to throw in. If not, I thought it might be fun to do a Proust questionnaire. How do you feel about that?
Mildly nervous, but I'm game.
Okay. It's between friends, right? And if anyone does have some questions, please throw them up. What is your idea of perfect happiness?
Perfect happiness is being with people you love, eating food that makes you feel whole, listening to music that moves your soul, and ending the day feeling complete.
Okay. What do you value most in your friends?
Presence. And I don't mean presence TS, those are great too. I mean presence CE, presence.
I like the TS ones myself, but
or both.
What do friends appreciate most in you, other than the free health advice?
Yeah, loyalty.
If you could fly anywhere right now, where would you go?
Israel.
Any particular part?
Two parts. One, Tel Aviv, because I love it, and I have family and very dear friends. And then the south of Israel, the Negev, is my favorite place in the country. But really, I want to go back because I'm desperate to bring this with me, and I'm desperate and really excited to show the work in Israel and to engage with the soldiers I photographed and have this kind of a discussion with people in the place where the work is centered.
Good. What is your source of inspiration?
Many things. Music, nature, other people's work. You know, I'm inspired by other photographers, obviously. You know, part of making this book it was learning about all the other work that had been done in Israel prior to me. And I think of work by someone who's become a really dear friend and mentor, Yaakov Israel, who's an amazing photographer. I'm a big fan of Nick Waplington, who did a book on settlers. Stephen Shore, you know, our friend Donald Weber, great source of inspiration and intellect. And just getting out and engaging with people, meeting people. I think hearing people's stories, again, you know, it's what I do every day, whether I'm a photographer or an emerge doc. And the only downside to being an emerge doc is the time pressure that you have to work under and not being able to really have a sit down and a chat with many people. So I'm inspired by the people I meet and the people I engage with, whether it's as a photographer or as a physician.
So that kind of leads me to my next question. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I think I'd like to be a chef.
I was going to say baker. You've been baking up a storm this pandemic.
Yeah, it's my solace and my balm during this crazy time when I'm home so often. So yes, baking and chefing are sort of related, but yeah, I think the thing I love most about baking is it's another craft. Just like photography is a craft and just like medicine is a craft, it's something that just takes time, patience, and dedication and attention. And the results are so, you know, like honestly, to give someone a loaf of bread that you just baked out of the oven is almost as good as giving someone a book that you spent 6 years making, if the bread's good.
Or your grandmother's plum cake, because that's what I'm talking about. Okay, Bagels, Montreal or Toronto?
Montreal. Not even a question. I thought you were going to go maybe Montreal, New York, but no, Montreal.
Sesame or poppy? Sesame or poppy?
It depends. If it's fresh out of the oven at St. Viator, sesame. If it's with lox and cream cheese, poppy.
I like your thinking. Hummentuschen, poppy or prune?
Only prune.
Okay, last one. Maple Leafs or Habs?
Oh gosh, don't insult me. I'm a diehard Tab fan to the core.
Okay, so we've got a nice
even though I'm in the land of the Maple Leafs.
That's good. We've got a nice Montreal boy, a stranger in a strange land living in Toronto.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's been really great. I already have a copy of your book, and I know how I can get it. How do other people get this book?
Really simple. If you go to my website, which is basically my name.com, brantslomovic.com, the first tab on the left-hand side says book. Yeah, so please, if you're going to order it through my website, indicate if you'd like me to sign it, because that's something I'm doing. And if you'd like me to sign it, just scribble a little note as you check out how you'd like me to sign it or who you'd like me to sign it to.
And if let me center that. Like, I love this photo. If I wanted this picture for my wall, are these for sale?
They are for sale. I'm doing a limited series of gallery prints, so they're fine art prints that are beautiful, if I can say so, because I have a really amazing print technician.
We use the same printer.
Yeah, we love him.
They're good.
So,
they're good.
Yeah, so if you just contact me through the website, I am happy to send a list of the available fine art prints and the catalog and prices. As you know, galleries are not open currently, so this is another great way to get work. And I think the other thing I'll say is, you know, even my wife for 5 years didn't really understand the purpose of making a book. She kept saying, I don't understand what the big deal is about a book. And as a photographer or a visual artist, there's not a ton of ways to get your work out into the world. You know, there's something about the internet and the web that makes photos look quite beautiful. But until there's something physical in the world, it just doesn't work the same way. And there's a very different experience. You know, if we want to talk about technical stuff for a brief moment, the size of the book, and every detail of the book, one of my favorites is this little bit at the top here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's this little stripy thing that is lovely. But everything, every choice, it's like building a house. I had my hands in every decision.
I think you actually, like, it was worse than building a house with you. You were stressing on every little detail. Yes, yes.
It was a labor of love, and I had just an incredible team. All that to be said, there's something very intimate about a book where you can just spend time with it. And again, it's an invitation for you to ask questions and look at work and question your own choices, your own decisions, your own beliefs. But the other side is when you see a print on the wall that's 40 inches by 60 inches, it's this immersive experience where you feel like you're almost in the landscape of Israel. Well,
I think this has been really great talking to you. I've had fun. I wish I could like see you in person and give you a hug, but this is the best we can do. So yeah, you're at least vaccinated. We're waiting.
I am vaccinated. I'm very privileged to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for hosting this. It's been a real blast, and it's always, like I said, it's a real privilege and a pleasure for me to show the work and talk about it, and let people know about this incredible thing that's happening, where thousands of young kids from Toronto all the way to South America and Russia are going to Israel to serve in the army.
How warm and wonderful and private and personal. And thank you, Dr. Brant, so very much for sharing your lone soldiers, for sharing the book, for sharing your talent, your enthusiasm, your smarts. This was an amazing presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Naomi.
Oh, my pleasure.
For helping us learn so much more about Brant, for asking all the right questions at the right time, and for doing such a great job of moderator. Thanks again.
Anytime. Thank you.
I also want to thank some of the people in the Adult Programming Center at Adath. Joe Traeger is chair. The Adath staff, Phil David, who's the executive director, who put on this evening's program. A recording of tonight's program and presentation will be posted in the Adath website in a couple of days. We look forward to seeing all of you who attended tonight at some future date when we'll host Barry Average, who is an award-winning producer of documentaries, and he'll be interviewed by another famous man, a film critic and television personality, Richard Krause. Jonathan Tobin, the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, who by popular demand is returning to Adath. And mark your calendar for Sunday, September 21st at 1 p.m. when we're hosting Tal Becker, the legal counsel for the Abraham Accords, Israel's peace treaty with the Muslim countries. So thank you all for attending. Keep safe, keep healthy, stay positive, test negative, wash hands,
mask.
And good evening, and masks and distance,
yes.
and good evening.
Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.